go.
Ready when you are. My presentation? Well, I usually go for about
That's a good thought.
That's a late one, isn't it? The work session of the Annapolis City Council for Thursday, March 21st, 2019. We call to order at 3:10. At this time, would everyone willing and able, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
The next item on the agenda is presentations, beginning with ID-404-18, discussion on mold in Housing Authority properties.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you. Welcome.
I can do this without a mic, or if you need.
Pull that over and
That's fine.
so it'll be recorded. Just press the green button. Thank you.
Yep. Sorry.
No
Usually
worries.
it's better not to give me a mic. So I'm Clifford Mitchell. Thank you all for inviting me, and I'm the director of the Environmental Health Bureau at the Maryland Department of Health. I should say it's lovely to be here in Annapolis today. It's probably an appropriate day to be talking about mold, given the weather. I should say that because I work very closely with both the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary and Tom Andrews, they said to say hello, if I may.
Right.
All right, so I can give you a little bit about me, and that may help explain the presentation. I was asked basically to come and talk about mold. That was the sort of sum and substance of what I was asked to talk about. And I was sort of half joking when I said I usually do this for about an hour and a half. So I'm a physician by training. I spent about 14 years at Hopkins at the School of Public Health, and my specialty is occupational and environmental medicine, and I did a lot of work on indoor air quality, including mold. And then I joined the state health department in 2006. So this is by way of saying that this is a subject that's actually near and dear to my heart. And so I'm happy to be here to talk about it, but I want to give that just as a background in case you have questions about that. So because I wasn't given any parameters about what to talk about, I actually want to sort of do a general overview, and then I'm happy to answer questions, but I want to do sort of the short version of this. You have these handouts in front of you and also up on the screen. So this is a sort of this is a model of indoor air quality and health effects that I presented at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. Surgeon General on indoor environments on health quite a number of years ago now. That's now in publication. But that was it was one of the first efforts by the Surgeon General to look at indoor health effects. People have been concerned about indoor health effects for a long time because we spend most of our time indoors. And as you all know, there's a very strong regulatory environment for outdoor air, which is regulated nationally by the Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act amendments and a bunch of other things. But indoor air has been and continues to be a largely unregulated topic. The reasons for that are historical. They have to do with the fact that people's homes were viewed as their possessions, and that regulating indoor air meant, to some extent, regulating behavior indoors. And so historically, we haven't done a lot to regulate the indoor environment. There are some exceptions to that, and I'll talk about those briefly, but they mainly have to do with the products that go inside of homes or buildings. And so, as you know, that there are now regulations by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, US EPA, and others that regulate things like emissions of volatile organic compounds by products that are used to build indoors. And there have been reasons for why those have happened, usually when bad things have happened as a result of various product defects. So just looking at this diagram, and I'll use the little pen lighter here. Okay, so you can see I'm just going to highlight some things. So when I think about the indoor environment, or when other people think about the indoor environment from an environmental health point of view, what they're basically thinking about are what are the sources that are potentially inside and or can affect indoor air quality. And they include things that are intrinsic to the building, like building design, the envelope, what's called the envelope, which is the shell of the building, HVAC systems, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning systems, the furnishings that are inside, then products, people themselves, and then there are external sources, things like smoke drifting in from outside or other kinds of issues. And then there are a bunch of moderating factors, and the moderating factors that have the biggest impact, particularly on the things that we usually encounter on indoor environments, are temperature and humidity, and I'll talk more about those. So those sources, whether they're inside the building or outside the building, give rise to a series of potential biological hazards, and those include things like particulates. Those are things that are solid particles, and they can be things like asbestos, fiberglass, or things that you might be familiar with, like particulate matter, which is either big, like 10 microns, or small, like 2.5 microns and smaller. Then there are a bunch of chemicals, which are not particles, but usually in the gaseous phase or the aerosol phase. And those include things that you might think of like VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which are the results often of off-gassing from glues and other adhesives, or they can be from combustion products, or they can be from other sources. And there are a bunch of those things. And including, and importantly for our discussion, there's something called microbial VOCs. Those are microbial volatile organic compounds, and they are the result of the respiration of microbial entities, including mold, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And then you get the biological stuff that's inside the building, and those include viruses, bacteria, sorry for the misspelling, fungi, and mold. And then there are other issues. And then there are things about the people inside that make them more or less susceptible to those hazards. Children, for example, have a great deal different susceptibility to a lot of things than adults. People who have pre-existing lung disease have different susceptibilities than people who are young and healthy. And then there are a whole bunch of other things that moderate individual susceptibility to exposures in the environment. And you get a whole bunch of things that can help or hurt how those take place in an individual or in a group of individuals, and they manifest as a bunch of health effects. Typically, the health effects that we hear about in indoor air quality, whether they're complaints to the health department or whether they're complaints to individual healthcare providers, have to do with things like sneeze, wheeze, shortness of breath, cough, or they can be other kinds of things in some cases. So that's sort of the overall framework for how you think about the biological part of this. The next thing is, how do you think about the regulatory part of this? And this is where my earlier comments have salience, because typically we don't regulate indoor air quality. There are no regulations for indoor air quality itself, either nationally or in any states. And yet, I will say that, because I've been the Director of Environmental Health here in the state since 2006, and I've worked with other state health directors, environmental health directors, over the years. We actually did a study where we did a survey of environmental health directors across the country. And indoor air quality complaints and mold in particular was often the top complaint made by citizens to health departments across the country. So it's not an unusual occurrence, it's a usual occurrence. And all other states have exactly the same regulatory framework which we do, which is that for the most part there is no regulatory framework, and there's specifically no regulation related to mold. The reason for that historically is twofold. The first is mold is molds naturally are naturally occurring in the indoor and outdoor environment. Anywhere you are, you're breathing mold from the moment you are born until the moment you die. And the mold concentrations outside are typically greater than they are inside. The reason for that is the number one source of mold is decaying vegetation and soil and the spores that are given off by that. And there's always circulating mold in the outdoor environment. So it's not, you're not walking from a mold-free environment into a mold-free environment ever. You're always walking from, going from an environment with a lot of mold to oftentimes, depending upon what the indoor situation is, oftentimes, usually, an environment that has less mold, especially if it's a building with a lot of filtration in it. It'll filter out a lot of those mold particles. So typically, mold concentrations outdoors are much greater than they are indoors. So the challenge oftentimes is, well, and there's one other thing. The other reason that there's no regulation for mold is there's no safe level of mold, because we adapt to mold and have adapted to mold over our entire lives. And when I say lives, I mean the human organism has adapted to mold. So mold is one of the things that we breathe in all the time, and then we have an immune system that typically processes that mold in the lungs and takes care of it. But if you look, a significant number of people, a significant percentage of the population has allergies to molds. And typically those are the molds that are most common in the outdoor environment: Aspergillus, Penicillium, Stachybotrys, Stachybotrys less so, but Cladosporium. These are all molds that circulate in the outdoors that a certain number of people develop a hypersensitivity to or reactions to. So that's sort of the framework for thinking about the regulatory framework. So oftentimes when you've got mold, the situation is, the mold is not the problem. The problem with mold, and this has been, the Institute of Medicine has said this, others have said this, the National Academy of Sciences has said this, everybody has said this. Basically, the problem with mold is never the mold, because mold is always there. The problem with mold is moisture. The problem with mold is that the thing that allows, mold needs two things to grow. It needs moisture and it needs a substrate, something it can feed on that's usually carbon-based. So wallboard and it's anywhere it's got carbon, it'll figure out a way to grow. But it needs moisture more than anything. So if you've got a damp environment, you'll get mold. And so typically, the reason buildings have problems is not because there's mold present. It's because there's a moisture problem in the building. And so the thing you have to fix there is not the mold, it's the moisture. Because if you don't fix the moisture problem, the mold will always come back. So, for whatever reason that is, leaky building, flood, leaky pipes, whatever, that'll cause mold. So I just want quickly to tell you, from a health effects point of view, the National Academy of Sciences and Institute of Medicine have looked at what mold causes, and there are some things that mold is associated with, some things that there's less confidence and less scientific evidence that mold causes. We know that there's sufficient evidence of an association that mold by itself will cause cough, it will cause wheeze, it will cause asthma symptoms in people with asthma, and there's suggestive evidence, although not conclusive, that it will also cause shortness of breath, or lower respiratory tract illness in otherwise healthy children, or the development of asthma. These are much more controversial because we don't actually know what causes asthma. But, and it's tough to figure out what actually causes asthma because it's a bunch of different things that all have to act together. But there is some evidence, potentially, that, although it's limited, that maybe mold plays a role in the development of new onset asthma. For sure, what it does is it can trigger asthma in people with asthma. But there's very little evidence, or insufficient evidence, I should say, at this point, to show that in a young, healthy person, otherwise, that mold causes systemic illness. Mold usually is a problem for people with pre-existing, some kind of problem, allergies, asthma, other kinds of things, or COPD, a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In those cases, it can be a problem. In young, healthy people, again, we have evolved to take care of mold, which is not to say you can't have too much mold, but it is a problem oftentimes in other situations. And the other thing, just to say, the second slide is about not so much mold, but damp indoor environments. And that's the distinction between this slide and the other slide. Even if you don't have mold, having dampness by itself can cause upper airway problems like cough, wheeze, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and asthma in other people. And then lower respiratory tract illness in otherwise healthy children. So that's just a clear, sorry, I reversed those. So the first slide was damp indoor environments by themselves. The second was damp indoor environments with mold. So there's a slight difference between those two slides. Overall, what I would just emphasize is the problem with mold is always dampness. And the problem with mold is always moisture, and if you don't fix the dampness and moisture problems, you will never fix the mold problem. And so you have to be careful about how you approach that. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Sure.
So, I'm familiar with everything you're saying, but what is it specifically about the mold? Is it the spores or mold, or is it that you're touching it? I mean,
a good question. So it depends on the specific health outcome that you're talking about. So for example, I've been in situations where people are complaining of itchy eyes and an itchy nose, and they may have their eyes and nose are running all the time. So that can be from two different causes. In sensitized individuals, oftentimes that happens even when somebody who's not sensitized walks into a place and doesn't feel anything, and that's an allergic reaction, and that's because the immune system, the system that mediates allergies, can detect very, very low signal of a single protein and amplify it and cause the reaction, right? However, you can also have a non-specific reaction, and there have been cases that I've been in where you've had very, very moldy environments with, the walls are black and it just looks, and you can sort of tell, and everybody walking into that building feels just off. Oftentimes that's a result of the physical the particles themselves. And what happens is, if you're in an environment like that, the particles pinging against the eyes and the nose and the mucosa, after a while can actually, there are a lot of fancy medical names for it, all of which mean that we don't know what actually causes it, but it appears to be the actual physical pinging of the particle against the mucosa and the tissue that actually causes this reaction. And that's a different mechanism than the allergic mechanism.
but the particle itself, is that mold flaking off, or is it?
Generally, that's the spore,
Okay.
right? And when you have mold that's growing on a wall, that smell that musty smell that you smell, remember I talked about those microbial VOCs? Those are a bunch of terpenes and alcohols and other organic chemicals that are the result of the respiration of the mold as it's growing. Mm-hmm. So those are not the particles, those are the gases that are given off by that. So it depends on which health effect you're talking about. All of them can be irritants.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman Finlayson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Black mold.
Yes.
Obviously, there are different types, some more dangerous than others.
So the question about black mold came up in the sort of early 1990s. And it started in Cleveland as a result of some observations by a pediatrician named Dor Dearborn, who noticed that there were a number of children who came who had, as infants, bleeding from the lungs. And it developed into a very serious concern that people had about whether or not, and there was sort of one factor that anybody could see in these kids was that they lived in housing in which there was dampness in the basement and a lot of mold, and some of it was black. And so there has been a concern about so-called black mold or toxic mold. The thing that people usually mean by black mold is a mold called Stachybotrys. It's got new names depending upon which genus you're talking about. It's been renamed a couple of times. But that mold, which tends to grow in dark, damp places like basements, has been found to have toxins, which is not that uncommon in molds. A lot of biological things contain toxins, and molds are no exception. And this one has a bunch of toxins, including some called stachytoxins, which can cause a bunch of things in laboratory animals. Liver problems, sometimes blood vessel problems, etc. If you, and there are other molds that are also toxic. They may not be black necessarily, but they are toxic. And so the reason for concern about those is if you actually take the mold itself and ingest it, or breathe it in great quantities, it has caused significant illness and fatality in laboratory animals, and other molds that are similar have caused fatalities in animals in a bunch of other settings. What hasn't been shown is that, and to be clear about this, when that mold is on the wall, it's got a gel capsule on it that actually that's not the mold itself. That mold is on the wall. It is not going anyplace. What is a concern with mold like that is, and the reason we don't recommend that if you're not a professional that you go in and if you've got a wall that's all black that you go in and do that yourself, is we don't want people breathing in large quantities of that while sledgehammering it. We want people who are trained professionals going in and doing it appropriately with appropriate personal protective equipment. That's the reason that those guidelines were issued by New York and others in the early 1990s. But to be clear about this, that's a very common mold. It circulates again on the outside and indoors as well. And there are literally thousands, if not millions, of homes as well as buildings where that mold exists because it's a very common mold. And it is, the reason for concern about it is if you take it out and you dry it and you feed it to people, that would be bad. But having it in place doesn't mean ipso facto that it's a hazard to the people there. It means that it should be abated, and the conditions that caused it in terms of the moisture should be corrected, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an imminent hazard to the people who are there, because it's stuck there on the side of the wall and it's not going anyplace. What you don't want necessarily is for people to abate that themselves, especially if there are large quantities of it.
So, you know, when we hear mold, we think danger, shut it down, close the building, you know, keep everybody away. But it doesn't sound like that's quite the reaction we should be having.
So that's a policy question. What I can tell you is that A, mold is incredibly common. B, the problem with mold, again, is what condition caused the mold to be there. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason I emphasize that if there's a problem with mold, it's that buildings are built not to be moldy, not to have mold growing. If mold is growing there, it is a sign to me that there is something wrong mm-hmm. with the control mechanisms of the building. And those do need to be addressed, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I have been in buildings that are very, very moldy. Some of them have been, just from a personal point of view, sufficiently moldy that I have thought that especially for people with lung disease or other pre-existing medical conditions, I do not want them in that building, especially if they're immunocompromised, because mm-hmm. that can be a real problem for people. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than simply saying if you see mold, that means the building has to be shut down and evacuated immediately. It does need to be assessed, and the reasons for the mold need to be addressed, absolutely. But you need somebody to look at it and figure out what the problem is. Does that answer the question?
Very much so. Thank you.
Alderwoman Tierney?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for attending and all of the work that you've done on this research. And also, you explained my concern on why there has been this lack of regulation, and specifically starting at the top with the EPA. And then basically because of that, there's a lot of hands-off in construction. I know ASHRAE says, American Society of Heating and Ventilation will say, you know, we can do this, but we can't control the dampness. So it leads to my question. I know that we're capable of doing humidity control. Is there any sort of technique for measuring the whole building dampness?
It's a very, very good question. So typically, okay, a couple of answers to that. So one is, as you know, it's not so much a question of whole building dampness, it's a question of dampness at the location where the mold could potentially be growing. So it's possible, as you know, to measure overall humidity in the building and in individual locations. But overall dampness in a building doesn't necessarily, well, two answers. One is the fact that you have an overall measure of humidity in a building is more an issue for comfort oftentimes than it is for mold, because mold will always grow at the point where the humidity is highest. And so even if overall the building is fine, if you've got an area where there's not a lot of air moving and there's a lot of dampness, or there's a pipe that's leaking or something else, the overall building humidity doesn't really make a difference. It's how much moisture is there at that spot. That's answer number one. Answer number two is the reason ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, talks about sort of overall where the comfort level is, and those guidelines are primarily for comfort, although there's some health in there as well, is, you know, on a day like today, you can't reduce the indoor humidity past a certain point because it's just physically not possible to get that much moisture out of the air when it's 100% saturated outside. So it's really tough to do in regular building systems. You try to keep it within a range, and that range is designed both for comfort and to try to minimize mold growth. Does that answer?
Alderman Henson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. So the remediating the indoor air quality. Once you take out the section where you can see the mold that's there visibly, when you spoke about the particles and the particulates that irritate people's eyes and throats and the itchiness, how do you get that out of the air if you remove the section where you see it? What do you do for the air quality?
Good question, Councilwoman. So the simple answer to that is, or not so simple, is in any building, especially sort of regular old buildings, there's a huge amount of air turnover. So if you're in a space where there's not a lot of ventilation and air is not turning over, that's where you tend to run into problems. It's a stagnant space where you can get a lot of particles floating, suspending. What typically happens in most buildings is if you take out the offending area, which is causing the problem, that air turns over after a while, especially if you reventilate that area. One of the big problems with big problems with many buildings is they're designed to operate with a certain amount of ventilation. Those are the ASHRAE recommendations. Over time, those recommendations, you know, have evolved, but what hasn't evolved necessarily is that we don't always do the amount of operation and maintenance to make sure that the building ventilation system is keeping up with changes in the building itself. So in modern buildings, one of the problems we often have is that ventilation systems designed for a certain configuration inside the office, And then people put up walls, and they put up cubicles, and they change the design, and the air conditioning, the ventilation system stays the same, and you end up with dead spots. That's where you have the problem you have mentioned, which is the air isn't moving. But if you get the air moving again, all of that stuff goes away because you're bringing in more fresh air on a regular basis. You're supposed to by design.
If you have is it possible that chronic or a reoccurrence of the same type of mold could be the cause of just poor housekeeping, that if a person is not wiping down the walls after steamy showers or not doing housekeeping practices, that it could cause mold to reoccur?
Bathrooms are one of the places where mold happens a lot because there's moisture there. So a lot of new buildings are now built, and that includes a lot of new homes are built with ventilation in the bathroom for exactly that reason, because you want to vent that moisture. Any place where you have excess moisture will grow mold. I feel very comfortable saying that. It's just one of those facts of life. So if you don't do if you don't do the things to maintain moisture the way it should be maintained, you're likely to end up with mold in the future.
I want to make sure I understand. Is it more of a structural thing, or is it more determined by the individual person and the way that they are operating in their space, that you could, as a person, be more diligent about wiping down things? Because I've been told that it's a housekeeping issue, and that's why we have a reoccurrence of mold in some places, because people are just not being diligent housekeepers.
So I guess the complete answer to that would be it could be either or both. If you have, again, it's, things are, you can have a situation where somebody is as diligent as possible, but if there is a leaky pipe, or if the building envelope is compromised, or if the window seals are not right, all the maintenance, all the drying you do in the world will not address that problem. You will end up with a moisture problem, even though you are completely diligent as an individual. On the other hand, all of us with bathrooms, if we do a good job and are diligent in terms of turning on the fan when we're showering and things like that, it can help to minimize mold growth. So it's really a combination of both. The one thing that's, or either, and it depends on the situation.
Testing for mold, and a person could look at a spot on the wall, and one person could think it's mold, one person could think it's something else, but there's like a definition of what is mold and what's just, I don't know, moisture.
So two things about that. Oftentimes, and this is a sort of an aside, oftentimes when people look up in their offices at their grates and they see sort of a wisp of black stuff leaving from the side of the ventilation grate in a pattern that gets more diffused, oftentimes that's actually not mold, that's particulate matter from traffic exhaust. And what happens, it comes into the ventilation system and it sort of diffuses out and then sticks. And that's one thing that often is not mold. But in terms of testing for mold, oftentimes if you talk to building air quality people, it is possible to test for mold, and you can identify the genus and species and all kinds of things. But I tend to oftentimes, and a lot of building air professionals also, will tell you that the most sensitive indicator of mold is walking in and using your eyes and your nose. And it's much more sensitive than doing very sophisticated tests, because if you walk into a space and it's got that musty smell and you see mold even sort of trailing along the edges, it's a pretty good bet that there's more mold there than meets the eye. You don't necessarily need to do a lot of sophisticated testing. Usually people do that for a variety of reasons. Most often, in my experience, they do it when people are concerned that there might be a mold problem, but there's no visible mold and there's been a series of leaks and people want to figure out what's going on. But oftentimes it's not rocket science, and it doesn't require a lot of sophisticated testing.
Do we have any licensing or certification or state regulations for testing mold? For
testing mold, no. I believe, and do not quote me on this, that there is some mold remediation on the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulations side for mold remediators. I don't spend a lot of space in that time, so I can't tell you that that's absolutely true. But in terms of mold testing, most of that is unlicensed, and there are a lot of people who do it, and some of them are, call themselves indoor air experts, and some of them call them building engineers, and some of them call themselves industrial hygienists.
You mentioned that disrupting mold, that when it's in place, it kind of has that coating on it, but disrupting mold could expose it and make it more harmful or hazardous. Am I correct in understanding that we do not have state standards on what you do when you're disrupting it or remediating or demolition in sites that may have mold?
Sorry for the interruption. No, it's a good question. New York established guidelines in the 1990s when people became very concerned about mold. And those guidelines actually sort of are what people use as guidance today, or some variation thereof. And they basically look at how much square surface area there is, and they say if it's a lot, get somebody professional in. If it's a spot on the wall, you're okay bleaching it and then wiping it down. And generally, there's no regulation on that subject, and the guidance really is pretty much, it's the in-between that I worry about. I tend to recommend to people that if they have any question, or if there's a substantial amount of mold, and people use 2 square feet, 4 square feet, whatever it might be, but if there's a substantial amount of mold, I like to have somebody professional look at it. The main reason I like to have somebody professional look at it is, again, the problem is not the mold. It's whatever caused the mold to be there. It's the moisture problem. And just bleaching the mold is not going to solve the moisture problem.
Am I correct that the state of Maryland does not have a demolition or remediation standard for mold?
So the health department has no standards for demolition and remediation. Again, I would refer you to the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation in terms of what guidance it uses. You could also ask the Department of Housing and Development whether or not it has codes on that topic. But again, if you look at things like the International Property Maintenance Code, I'm not an expert in that, but usually those property maintenance codes talk more about moisture and about control of moisture and those kinds of things, and maintaining a dry environment, because that's what causes the problem.
You mentioned the Cleveland case study that had the children with the liver, I think you said blood vessel problems and bleeding.
Bleeding from the lungs.
Bleeding from the lungs. Where is the research on that? Are there any research studies being done on?
So it's a very interesting question, and it's perplexed people for a long time. There was a reanalysis of those data which actually showed that mold was probably not the causal concern in those cases, and there was a lot of discussion in the scientific literature and amongst professionals about whether or not mold could have been implicated in some way. I think in most cases, there has not been a definitive link between mold exposure and any of those more systemic illnesses. What we do know is that there is a group of individuals, particularly people with immune compromise, who, if you expose them to mold, especially significant quantities of mold, can develop especially pulmonary problems, lung problems, or systemic infections. And those are the people I am most concerned about in very, very moldy environments, are people with pre-existing, especially immune compromise, either from cancer, steroid use, other kinds of problems.
You mentioned an allergic reaction to it in people with that particular allergy. Is there any possibility for an anaphylactic allergic reaction to it? So
there's always a possibility of anaphylaxis. Most of the time, though, that's not what causes anaphylaxis. And I think I would be speculating here, but I think the reason for that from a biological point of view is probably that because people are exposed to that mold all the time from the time they are born, it would be highly unlikely that they would all of a sudden develop an anaphylactic reaction. Much more common would be an asthmatic reaction, because anaphylaxis is so catastrophic they would basically be triggered all the time.
Do pets have any sensitivity to mold? Is their reaction similar to the way that humans process that?
I am not a veterinarian, although I work very closely with the state public health veterinarian. For some health effects of mold, animals clearly, because they are biologically similar to us in many respects, can have similar reactions, but I am not an expert on animal physiology.
Thank you.
Alderman Arnett.
So I believe the proximate reason why we wanted to know more about this is because one of our public housing communities has a significant mold problem. I think you've already kind of given us the hint that it's not the mold, it's the moisture. So, and I just went into my basement today to get some documents, and I'm clogged up, so I know I have a moisture problem too. What do you do about the moisture problem?
Well, that depends on what the cause is or the causes are. And oftentimes it's multiple causes. You know, older housing in this country was built to breathe. It's supposed to get damp, and then it's supposed to give off the moisture. That's what it's supposed to do when we build with natural materials like rock, wood, etc. Newer buildings, especially buildings in the 70s during the energy crisis and afterwards, were built with the assumption that they were going to have integrity from moisture, that you could basically isolate them from the outside. And the problem with that is that when it fails in a big way, oftentimes. So it depends on what the problem is. Sometimes the problem is as simple as a leaky pipe that is condensing and releasing water, and you have to fix that problem. Sometimes it's more complicated, like all of the seals and all of the windows have gone, and so you've got moisture that for years has been dripping in between the envelope and the outdoor seal, and it can be a very tough challenge. Depends, and roofs leak, and you know, it's oftentimes a question of deferred maintenance and upkeep and other kinds of things.
I'll ask the myth about cleaning it with bleach. Can you address that, or is it not a myth?
So bleach, which is a very powerful oxidizing agent, kills mold. It's very effective at killing mold. I'm always a little cautious because pure bleach that you get right out of the container is much stronger than it needs to be to kill the mold, and can also cause damage to tissue, and you can get off-gassing, and I don't want people breathing it. So, it's dilute bleach will still do the job, and it does kill mold. It's a very toxic chemical. It's toxic to all living things. So it's not a myth that bleach works. The myth is that if you bleach the mold, it will stay away. That's the myth, okay. Because it's the moisture. It will definitely come back again if you haven't corrected the moisture problem.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. So our housing authority is telling us as soon as they find an incident, or as soon as it's reported, they go to the source, mitigate the moisture, let it dry out, and that's how they treat it. They treat it sectionally. Mm-hmm. And then they say, but it reoccurs in the bathroom. So how many people in this group, put your hand up if you have mold in your bathroom? Yeah. Just us? Just us two? Oh, geez. That's three? All right.
That probably means we don't know.
So thank you, Mr. Mitchell. When's your next convention? I want to come and party with you guys.
I am told that funeral directors actually have the best convention. That's what I am told by people who should know.
Well, it was very informative. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, you want your video?
Not even a spot. Go ahead. Come on. I mean, you spray it and it goes away, but then it comes back.
But if that's all we're doing, we can go home now, right? Because we can go home and watch the video. Yeah. He's not going to make an appearance, so we can throw tomatoes at him. Oh, he's not? I don't know. Is he?
So, Ms. City Attorney, please present the next item on the agenda.
The next item on the agenda is ID-410-18, Ignite Annapolis 2.
And,
Always,
oh, sorry.
if you always do what you're what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got.
And I'm going to just hand this over to Alderwoman Tyranny just to give a little update on the handout.
Wasn't it on?
Nope. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This all sort of happened by happenstance because recently Alex Klein, who is a constituent and very, who is a collective constituent, sorry, I didn't mean to be possessive. He's very well known as far as his bicycling and pedestrian-focused initiatives. He couldn't be here today, so he asked me to hand out, to supplement this video, this hard copy of this article by a gentleman named Daniel Herridges, who either started Strong Towns or is a strong partner in Strong Towns. So I thought it best that you read this on your own, but the most important thing is to tell you very quickly what Strong Towns is all about. And let me just back up and say, I think we're in the position, perhaps with the elevation of the Forest Drive sector study, is we're probably at a point where we should at least agree on what we can agree on. And this Strong Towns philosophy is something that we should probably all look at. And let me just read what their philosophy is very quickly. The Strong Towns approach is a radically new way of thinking about the way we build our world. We believe that in order to truly thrive, our cities and towns must stop valuing efficiency and start valuing resilience. 2, stop betting our futures on huge, irreversible projects and start taking small, incremental steps and iterating based on what we learn. 3, stop fearing change and start embracing a process of continuous adaptation. 4, stop building our world based on abstract theories and start building it based on how our places actually work and what our neighbors actually need today. And 5, lastly, stop obsessing about future growth and start obsessing about our current finances. So their website is strongtowns.org. I'm not advocating you to join them or anything, but it's basically a step back into sort of redefining the argument, not so much into anti-development versus pro-development. It's much more complicated than that. And so I'll let Alex speak away.
Wait, before we do that.
Yes.
My problem with this article is it only focuses on one side of the equation. That's my problem with the Forest Drive sector study. I don't have a problem with growth, as long as you plan for it and you mediate it. If growth is going to bring more traffic, what I've heard Alex say is, we'll just make it so bad that people have to get out of their cars. I don't think that's responsible public policy. I think that we have to do, as this article says, moderation. I believe in moderation in all things, except maybe drinking. But you can't just sort of say, oh, we're going to cast the seeds to the wind and let what happens happen, because there are consequences of growth. And if we don't plan for those consequences, I don't think they need us. We just close the doors and let it happen. So, I mean, I think I really had a strong negative reaction to this article. It's more that build it and they will come, and then we'll figure out what to do after that kind of a mindset that I find very troubling. But we'll see what Alex has to say.
Thanks, Hillary.
Can you ask him to move closer to the mic?
Main Street has a human scale because it was built when people parked everywhere, and that's accommodate cars here, but they are not the dominant feature, despite sometimes denial or focus on parking and staff. Travel out of town on West Street, you can find a typical modern building with separated uses, car park, fast traffic, and single parking. Ugly, lovable, and impressive for anyone outside of the car. This is known as the Stroad, three-road highway. Combines people, businesses, and residences with high-speed traffic. The result is dangerous and devalued the area, and sadly, it's difficult to describe. Look for the intense buildings we have today. Downtown is a pleasant, people-oriented place. It's not about the architecture and the use, rather about how people interact with the building. Around here, I just want to sit, have a cup of coffee, and chill. The Arizona Code often requires an auto-centric design. It's a marvel of Texas engineering. Lots of parking, stormwater management, brick sidewalks, something for everybody. Beautiful, right? But how often do you say, let's stroll down up to West Street and Tequila? Everyone loves Snowflake Alley. It's inviting and interesting. Get you where you want to go quickly. And follow the observation made by the famous Jacobs book. Both blocks must be short, and it is street and opportunity to turn corners must be reached. On the other hand, for old concept, 900-foot walk length is definitely not used to scale. Well, according to the planner checklist standpoint, blocks are long and boring and not good. It's a smart road, so it's got to be good, right? Napa sets the terrific civic architecture, but more important is the building form and location on the street makes it an interesting place to walk by. Fast forward to the 70s when a rental center was built. It's placing on the block high for people, and that wall is so despotic to anybody walking by. We probably should paint a mural with some of our favorite dictators on it. What kind of nonsense is this? These are three-story townhouses on Prince George Street, one of those minor places in town. Great walkable urbanism. Could we build this legally today, given our minimum parking requirements? These days we go in townhouses, they're really just houses without a town. We part of that in areas because no one complains about it. And then we wonder why everybody drives everywhere. I call it density without urbanism. Street layouts determine how easy it is to get around. Once cars gained mass popularity, Americans started using them as prosthetic devices. We changed the pattern because it was assumed everyone would drive everywhere, so connectivity was important. Our older neighborhoods like East Portland, Nashville, and Murray Hill have traditional street routes that make walking and biking efficient and pleasant. And as an invested, they distribute car traffic, energy, and gain of urban but now we create one-way in and one-way out cul-de-sac neighborhoods to produce the idyllic American dream of fast. So they greatly lengthen the distance people travel to get. The result is everyone has to use the same pavement, whether they're commuting to work or can't afford it all. We put this together with black connections and end up on the walkers, cyclists, and riders on busy, congested roads. Schools are important, of course, but when we use buildings to fight every little thing we don't fight, we end up with a Byzantine postmaster, and that often produces large destructive change. That's exactly what we're fighting against in the first place. So let's pick our battles carefully. For the comprehensive plan update, let's do things differently and get back to promoting people-oriented places. We allow smaller, cemental change in our city to evolve organically like before. The right balance is no neighborhood should experience radical change. At the same time, no neighborhood sure, we might end up with something ugly or cool with taking into perspective. But that's what vibrant cities are.
What is that?
I don't do it.
So we're going to always do what we've always done, and always get Thanks for listening. If you found out what's interesting, check out my blog at eastline.org for deep dive.
With more audio, so. Thank you. Ellie, did you want?
Again, he couldn't be here, but he just thought it was a nice intermission with the Forest Drive sector study debate and embracing some incremental change. So I hope you heard it. The sound wasn't very
couldn't
good.
hear it.
Couldn't hear it? No.
Yeah.
But if I may, Mr. Mayor,
Sure.
one of the things that I've been ruminating about is this whole notion of form-based zoning, which to me is very much like our Title 2124, which is planned development. You just approve the box, you have no idea what's going to go in the box, the market is going to determine that. The market usually goes for the highest rate of return. And I've been trying to square this with our whole One Annapolis affordability, accessibility, because the highest rate of return is usually expensive. And it doesn't lead to a diverse, well-rounded community. It leads to Carmel or Palm Beach or places like that, enclaves of wealthy. So I'm sorry, I guess I'm an interventionist. I don't think you can just leave this to the market, as this article and form-based zoning seems to indicate we should do. And I don't think that if we are going to just turn it over to the market, we can assume that the market is going to take care of all of the externalities, all of the infrastructure, all of the road improvements, all of the transit improvements that are necessary. I think that's going to get dumped back on us and our coffers. We don't have impact fees in the city. It's one of the things when the city attorney gets her feet under, I want to get right on, is doing that. So we talk about, and Pete Gutwell talks about it, and I like the way Pete thinks, but he talks about making people pay for these investments. We've never done that. We don't even have a mechanism to do it. So that's why I think all of us in our gut are paying so much attention to the sector study, and I'm really pleased with the amount of work that we're all putting into that, because it really is the launching point for the rest of the city. I live in constant fear, and maybe I just don't have anything better to do, that we're going to turn Annapolis into Bethesda. And I don't want to live in that Annapolis. I think that we can do better. I think we are smart enough, if we work together and we have some professional help, to figure out an Annapolis that can accommodate more people, can accommodate doing more things, but it's going to be hard work. And we can't just assume it's going to happen because the market knows what we need. So I really not too pleased by this article. I understand Alex's point of view. One of the things I object to, and I'll just tell those of you who know her, I was talking to Ellen Moyer, and she said she tried to get on her bicycle the other day, a month ago, and discovered she no longer knows how to ride a bicycle. In fact, she doesn't have the balance to do it. And you can't ride a bicycle comfortably in a day like today. You certainly can't have bags of groceries. So we can't just sort of be cavalier and say, well, we're just going to have bicycles and that sort of stuff. It doesn't fit everybody, including a lot of people who already do live here.
But walking is all right, right? I mean, walking, running,
Yeah,
biking,
right.
same
They
thing.
carry 5 bags of groceries, plastic bags, of groceries from Giant to Eastport somewhere. You know.
Yep.
Actually, I don't, because I'm not allowed to shop.
Have you
My
had a
wife-
run at the impact fees in the 14 years you were here? Have you tried that before or not?
Have I tried impact fees?
Yeah, have you done anything in that front?
We have it in the
No.
city. I mean, I know the county has it. I think one of the things we ought to do, and that's what I asked Linda, is can we just look at what the county has? Teresa's looked at it, and I don't think she thinks we might be able to do better, which maybe we can, I don't know, but we need to do something. because we can't have all of the aftermath of the development dumped on us, where we have to pick up the pieces. We don't have the resources to do that. So, you know, and I'm looking at the Eastport Shopping Center, that apartment building, and I'm looking at what the rents are going there for, and I'm waiting to see when people finally realize that that's going to be the biggest building in Eastport, and they start to realize that people are not going to pay for parking in the structured parking, they're going to come onto the streets, and they start to realize that it's not possible to get out of Americana Drive and Monroe because the traffic flow will be just like Forest Drive. It'll be a mini Forest Drive. And there's no mediation being paid. The open space, the required 5% open space, they paid a fee in lieu of $3,800. How could we let them do that? How could we let them pay? That's chump change. And we aren't going to have open space. And, you know, we think about this when we think about the Hillman Garage and how we may leverage the Hillman Garage to get a couple of things. There's no leveraging. The community got nothing out of this development, and we'll get nothing out of it. So I really think the fate of the future of Annapolis is really in our hands right now with the next comp plan, with all of the things that we're thinking about doing, which could be wonderful. And not just Ellie and I were at the rollout last night, but it was really exciting to think about what the city dock could be. But, you know, I think we have to be very smart about how we leverage all of these things. And I don't know how many different things Hillman Garage can buy.
I agree. We need to put on the private sector some of our infrastructure needs, and I think we haven't done that, so we can move in that direction. Alderman Savage, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Alderwoman Tierney, for getting the conversation started on this. I did watch the video before I came, fortunately, so I could hear it better. And I do, I think I agree with the end goal in terms of, and a lot of the problems that Alex laid out in terms of the it's kind of a backwardness in our code and the way it's set up and the zoning that allows for some of these things like the Arundel Center. He's right, that makes no sense. And I think we each, I think, could point to some development in the city that doesn't really make sense. And how it's not pedestrian friendly or bike friendly. And again, I think we all would probably agree with wanting to resolve and avoid those issues. But for me, the question, I'm not clear on the solution. And I'm not clear what Alex is advocating or what he thinks would be the solution or what strong towns. I mean, I've tried to skim through this as I'm sitting here, the article, but I didn't see a specific solution offered. I mean, I think I saw it in the video. He did have form-based zoning up there as one idea. I don't know if that's one tool in their toolbox they would use, but you know, I think I'm not opposed to trying form-based zoning. I think the original intention from the 2009 comp plan, it said, let's try it in the opportunity areas, which were, you know, Crystal Spring, Bay Ridge, I think maybe West Street, I can't remember. But there are a couple different opportunity areas. Yeah. But there are a couple areas, small areas to try it in, which I think would have been great, and really it should have been done, and I think even the plan said it should have been done within 2 years after the adoption of the 2009 plan, but it never was for whatever reason. The sector study seems to be now proposing it for, again, 2/3 of the city, which I think is a bit, as I've said before, a bit too ambitious. Because even if you look at, so I think maybe if we have a part 2 to this at some point, if we get like a briefing on form-based zoning, but again, some of the other solutions. Now, I do want to point out to some folks in the 2009 comp plan, there was an appendix, one of the appendices, Appendix D, a spectrum of zoning techniques. It looks at Euclidean zoning, which I think is what we currently have. Where are we? incentive zoning, plan development, looks at overlay zoning techniques, unified development ordinance, subdivision regulations, composite zoning, performance zoning, and form-based code, and smart code it's called. And it's a really interesting table to go through because they do have general description, typical applications, pros, cons, if it's whether or not it's currently in use in the city, and then potential to meet comprehensive plan policy requirements. So for form-based zoning, lists the pro as considered to be the most market-friendly form of development regulations due to its lack of focus on land use. In its purest sense, a form-based code can be the simplest code to implement. The smart code, a derivative of form-based codes, has been created to respond to more traditional planning needs. But the thing that, again, gives me a little pause is the most market-friendly, because I do feel like there need to be some kind of controls, and I'm not sure form-based zoning provides that. There's in Ward 6, the Royal Farms wants to come in, which I think, again, people I don't think have a problem with the mart itself and the food services, but I've heard a lot of questions about whether or not another gas station, and because gas stations are prohibited by a use in that area, so they'd have to, apply for a variance or a special exception. Would that be allowed under form-based zoning? How would they encourage the kind of development they want to see? And lastly, I'll just say, because there's the one technique. Let's see. They said for form-based zoning in here, they said it's a difficult option for community-wide implementation in Annapolis. An option for Annapolis and opportunity areas, particularly in regards to the Catherine property, which is Crystal Spring, Village of Providence Point. But they actually recommended performance zoning. Said this is particularly suited to the Annapolis Comprehensive Plan as a complete conversion of existing development regulations. Performance zoning could initially be used in opportunity areas established in the new comp plan. But those are the kind of, I think we should start to experiment with some of these different techniques and maybe I don't know who put together this appendix, but call them back in, see if they want to present on some of these techniques. And I'll end my filibuster there.
Thank you. Can I get Alderman Tierney?
Oh, just, I think this article is probably, I'll say it for myself, I think that Alex probably, we needed to for lack of a better word, sort of dumb it down a little bit. This probably isn't the best article because it appears that you misunderstood it. The gist of this article is to say that this city is very complicated and we can't look at areas individually, that what we do in one ward affects the other. Ward 1, I don't want that to be the revenue base for the entire city. And to your argument of suburban areas being suburban areas and property tax could pay for the whole city, not with an aging infrastructure. Your property taxes would go up. And then you would just have, as you say, Carmel, and I don't believe that that's what we want. To defend, I don't believe that. But to defend the form-based zoning, and it'd probably be good to have a discussion about that, I call it block-by-block zoning. The Royal Farms is a perfect example. There it is, isolated. What does that do for the community? Now, it does bring up the idea of what do we want Forest Drive to be? If we want it to be a thoroughfare out of Dodge, then there you go. There's our convenience store and our gas station, and life is good. I don't think that's fair to the potential that we have on Forest Drive. And the other thing that this brings up, and is what do we expect this Forest Drive sector study to be? And I keep going back to the Ward 1 sector study, which is 20 years old, and I still use it as a reference, as a guideline. I heard testimony last night thinking that once it's adopted, that we're going to start building, and someone's very valid concerns, because it's when you don't know, you're fearful. And we need to tell the constituents that this sector study is a reference, it's a stepping stone. And I think that we've already missed that. I mean, the politics and the fear postings on Facebook are already out there, and I'm not sure how we're going to rectify that. But the first step is to agree, on as far as the council, on what we want Annapolis to be, and how we want each ward to contribute to the health of the other. Thank you.
Alderman Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If people who understand it better could help me understand it better, the sector study speaks about the importance of the form of something over the use of something. And I felt like the sector study, when I took a deeper look at the data, really showed us what we had a need for in the city of Annapolis, and that it really drove that we needed to better plan for the use of things as opposed to just the facade. That it was saying that the character of communities is defined by the aesthetics of the building, not necessarily what's happening in those buildings. If we have communities that have a 46% unemployment rate, why are we not prioritizing buildings that have jobs inside of them? Why are we prioritizing buildings that look like a picture on a page that's defined as a village? I don't understand why that is priority as opposed to what's happening inside of it. I don't get the value of that. I didn't understand it.
Here.
Alderman Annette, a quick one.
No, I agree with you, and in fact, I was going to quickly look up one of the solutions was in the mobility section where it says we need to develop buildings that have jobs that are more likely not to require driving back and forth from work and so forth. And I think that's an intriguing sounding notion, but I have two questions about it. One, that seems very prescriptive, like Euclidean zoning, because you're now telling what kind of business and employers are going to be in there. And two, if you can direct that it has those kinds of things, you can also direct the kinds of buildings that would do exactly what you're saying. Be more likely to have employment for people at the lower wage area, but can have jobs. And that's why I think we need to identify what those kinds of jobs, or get someone to help us find out what kinds of jobs those are and how we can incent. I mean, the one thing about the sector study is there's no direction and there's no incentive. You're not going to get people to do what you want unless you give them a reason to do it. And that's either you're going to provide incentives or restrictions. And so that's the hard part about making these things work, is figuring out how you can get the community, the developers or wherever, to bring you the things that the community needs. And that's not in the sector study.
Pindell Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess speaking from a Ward 3 perspective, and I mentioned this at the Housing and Human Welfare Committee meeting the other night, our fear is basically whatever we do within the city doesn't end up like a balloon coming towards Ward 3. In other words, it may all be great within the city, but then it bottles up or bottlenecks towards Ward 3 because we've got city, county, state roadways. It bleeds over to the Upper West Street sector study. We've got a problem at Chickwapin Forest and that intersection. And so whatever is done within the city, there's a good possibility, whatever the zoning is, it's going to be, and the other thing, it's going to be a bottleneck within our area. The other thing is, I lost my thought. Just that quick. Because we abut, thank you, Alderwoman Maternity, we abut the county basically in the Route 2 area on the West Street, but the Route 2 area in Forest Drive on the Forest Drive section, we have no control over what goes in the Annapolis Town Center. I mean, look at Maris behind Double T. We had no control over how many units they built, so we're at the mercy of the county and whatever they do. So we're kind of squeezed between, in many ways, the city and the county. And of course, that lends itself to the public safety issue out there. So that's our fear out in Ward 3. Whatever's done within the city, it doesn't balloon out into our area of the city. So, thank you.
Alderman Savage. Yeah, Alderman Savage.
Just a quick comment. I mean, just another comment on performance zoning, which again, I don't know much about other than what's in the spreadsheet, but it sounds like it might be kind of a compromise or a meld between form-based and Euclidean. But so for example, on the description, it says performance zoning is exclusively designed to focus on community character and the ability of site design to perform according to the community's vision. Performance zoning continues to consider use as an instrumental component of character. So it kind of seems to pull over the community character idea from form-based with still looking at, I guess, trying how do we actually get them to adhere to the community vision, and also has the use idea. So I don't know. Things to look into more, I suppose.
Thank you. Alderwoman Finlayson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Several years ago, we attempted to legislate how we would abut the Parole Town Center and what kinds of activities we could have in our city that would not force pressure on the city, giving us some of the same opportunities that the town center affords the county. That was unsuccessful. We can control what goes on Forest Drive by zoning, because you're absolutely right, Alderwoman Henson. We need job opportunities, and not low-paying job opportunities. We need livable wages for our residents. Is Forest Drive a thoroughfare to 50? I mean, if that's what we want it to be, then we can just shut down all the businesses and let people haul tail through the city to get to 50 so they can get out of town. I think we have a bigger responsibility, that Forest Drive should be a livable street like West Street and Main Street and every other thoroughfare in the city, where we have a combination of businesses and residents. We control that. You know, folks outside the city don't control that. We control that. So we've got to decide what we want to be. Okay, do we want to shut it down and just be a highway? You know, community character, and I still don't know what that means. I know what the community character was when I grew up in Eastport. It's not there now. Okay, I know what the community character was on Forest Drive. Not there now. So I don't know what that means, and I don't know who gets to decide. What I'm hearing is other people get to decide. We don't. And I think we're the representatives. At least 5 of us have Forest Drive in our ward, maybe 6 of us. So I would think that we would be the ones verbalizing what we see as community character. You have to be brave to step up and speak up. But that's what we're here for. Thank you.
We just did a little tech thing at the new MAFE building the other day, and one of the tech guys, and there was a lot of heavy hitters there, they said, we need a 5G training center. Like, you know, if we became the 5G, you know, the head of everyone else on 5G, I mean, the installation just in that it's really, really well-paying jobs, and there's not enough people to do it. So just something like that would just be a huge job creator. Who was next?
I'm sorry. Did somebody not speak yet? I just, Bob Waldman and I were chatting about this, and one of the things that the Forest Drive sector study is a little bit weak on is the chicken and egg issue. You know, what happens first, and of course the messaging of that. But what it has a lot of is data, and it shows very clearly that we have more people than jobs. And so it's a matter of getting the jobs there. And to get the jobs there, and when you're dealing with a company like that, you have to make the area attractive. And one of the short-term goals it said was street beautification and maybe, you know, some signalization and stuff that we could be doing now. So it just leads me to the question, and Ross, I'll turn it to you, because you said, you know, this is going to take hard work, and we are in the middle of we have a responsibility, and we're already willing and able to work, and I just want to know what your definition of hard work is to get this Forest Drive sector study the attention it deserves, whether to adopt or not adopt. Thank you.
Yeah, I think many of us are already doing it. I've spent countless hours pouring through the sector study, and it has brought forth the need for a lot more information, a lot more expertise, and really that's kind of what the planning department is doing now. They were going to contract out the comp plan. We didn't get a successful bidder, so now they're contracting for outside expertise that'll be on demand as it's needed. I think we really need to work with our partners on the Planning Commission. And so part of hard work is we're going to have to devote some time to meetings. We're going to have dialogue just like we did. I subscribe to a lot to what Sheila said, what Shanika said. I'm just trying to figure out, do we even have a choice whether Forest Drive is a thoroughfare? It is a thoroughfare. How do we stop it from being a thoroughfare? I didn't see anything in the sector study that stopped it from being a thoroughfare. So if we don't want it to be a thoroughfare, what is it we're going to do? And what is, when you have a peninsula, one way in, one way out, what is the alternative to a thoroughfare? Particularly when we're kind of a bedroom community. Most of the people who live down there do not work in the city. They work in Washington or up at the airport. So how do we affect policies that could change that?
Alderwoman Pendle Charles, and we shouldn't be debating the sector study now, can we?
Oh, well. I just have a question. Two things. Number one, what many people fail to realize and remember, there are two parts to Forest Drive. It's the eastern part, which goes from Ward 7-ish up to Chickwapin. And then there's the other piece, which is extremely important to Ward 3, is from Fairfax Crossing to Old Solomon's Island out to Riva Road. And the reason, the importance of it going out to Riva Road is because we heard information from Mr. Gordon that the multimodal transit center may be going out in that direction. We don't know. So there are two distinct parts of Forest Drive, which are totally different. The other thing is, I believe, before we talk about anything about zoning and all of that in the city, we need to get some discussions, talk, whatever, between the county and the state, because we in Ward 3 cannot survive if we do not talk or have some agreements with the county and the state. Otherwise, for us, this is all for naught.
We have incredible access now, I think, so. Yeah. Alderwoman Finlayson.
You know, we keep talking about one way in and one way out. People who live on Annapolis Neck have more than one way out of the city. They may not like the other ways. Okay, yeah, they can swim out. That's another way. So that makes it 4 ways they can get out. They can always go down Bay Ridge and take Hilltop and go to Spar Road and go out Taylor Avenue. Or, heaven forbid, they go through Eastport, cross the bridge, and go through downtown. But that is an alternative. You know, so to say Forest Drive is their only way just doesn't make sense. It's not the only way. So, you know, maybe we need to be opening up some other avenues for people to think they can get out. Or maybe we reduce the speed so kids can walk, which is, you know, that was part of our discussion in the fall, and do some other things to make it a livable street.
And that's why I'm asking for smart streetlights so that you can turn down Bay Ridge and go through, presuming we've taken care of the nuisance flooding, go across the bridge and get elsewhere. But yeah, you're right. There are other approaches, but they're not very satisfactory, and that's why people do try to scoot out Forest Drive.
Satisfactory because they can't go 50 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. So here we go with the highway again.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, Ms. City Attorney. Next on the agenda.
Mr. Mayor, the agenda has been completed.
Anything else for good order?
Announcement.
Yes.
Today, 7:30, the film festival begins.
Yes.
Red carpet, I think, starts at 6:30.
Right.
So please, I hope, and I think there's passes, Susie has them, or someone has them. 70 films. Saturday night is African American History Night, and forgot the actress that's supposed to be here. Shame on me. Lynn Whitfield. Yeah, but lots of other folks. So come out and enjoy the films. There's parties each night, and support our film festival. It's awesome. Thank you.
Did everyone get their? You're all going? So there's a 5 o'clock party over here, right, for all of us, right?
5 o'clock is the reception.
Reception, okay.
Yeah. at Fido's?
I thought Fido's was tomorrow, but I might be wrong.
I don't
It's
know.
usually on State Circle. It's usually at Calvert House, isn't it? Unless they changed it. I haven't looked, sir.
I don't know, I had it on my...
Okay, Alderman Savage.
Move that we adjourn.
Yes.
When he comes back, we'll be done.